We talk often about writing cookbooks in the US, but what is it like to write, photograph, and publish a cookbook in Singapore? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and I'm here with Andrea Nguyen. So, Andrea, I have to ask, we have listeners from all over the world. Did you know that we have a crew listening to us all the way in Singapore and Australia and Sydney, Melbourne, Italy, various states that I've never been to? It's pretty cool.
Girlfriend, we are global.
We are. And I think that's why we're well overdue to talk to one of our friends in Singapore, because it's a really interesting cookbook market. And it's on the other side of the world. We had to work on the time zone thing, but we were able today to talk with Chris Tan, who's an award-winning Singapore-based food writer, photographer, and cooking instructor. And I believe he's a friend.
Yes. Chris and I have been friends for a very, very long time. We bonded when I was a contributing editor to Saveur magazine. He was writing a lot for Saveur. We geeked out on a lot of stuff. And he was always on email. So when I was writing Asian dumplings, I met up with him for the first time in Singapore. And we did dumpling crawls and talked about dough and flour and starches. So that started a long friendship that has spanned well over 10 years. And every time we write a cookbook, we mail a copy to each other.
Oh, so you're like cookbook pen pals.
Exactly.
That's such a great story. It shows sort of that if you go to Singapore and you have a question about local food, he's kind of the person to ask.
He totally is. I describe him as Singapore food royalty because both his parents were food writers and he became one too. And his latest book, Nerd Baker 2, Tales from the Yeast Indies, is a follow-up to his popular book called Nerd Baker. I just absolutely love it. It's packed with baking tips and tons of step-by-step photos. And even if you don't bake from it, it's just like got so much information that you can take away and apply to so many different kinds of cuisines.
I agree. And I think it's one of those that if you've ever looked at the section of a cookbook and gotten bored by, they have a standard equipment and ingredients section, well, maybe pick up a copy of Chris's book and learn how to do it to make it exciting and useful, because he really nails it. And so let's bring on Chris and go behind the scenes on how he wrote Nerd Baker 2 and what else he's been working on. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, Chris.
Thank you for having me. So glad to be here.
We're really looking forward to talking to you about your newest book, Nerd Baker 2, Tales from the Yeast Indies. But before we get started, for our listeners to get a little bit more of a sense of place of Singapore, I mean, it's such a cosmopolitan place for cooking and baking, and there's so many cultural influences. But I wanted to know just, what does that mean for cookbooks? What is the cookbook market like in Singapore?
It's an interesting one. I mean, we're a port city, so we're a place where cultures have crossed for, many centuries. That's no different when it comes to the cookbook market. You go to our bookstores here and they're full of cookbooks from all around the world. Like all the major releases that you get in the UK and the US and Australia make their way here. So in a way, it's kind of challenging for local authors because, we have to put our stuff on the shelves, or rather we have to get our stuff on the shelves next to all these huge million-selling international releases. As you say, we are a very cosmopolitan society. We have a polyglot cuisine, many different ethnic communities here, and they all contribute to what we think of as our local food. But people tend to be quite adventurous cooks. We all, Singaporeans, grow up surrounded by different cuisines, so we are typically very unfazed by different foods and unusual foods and new foods.
You mentioned something that was really interesting, Chris. You said that to get your books on the shelves alongside international bestsellers and whatnot, the Martha Stewarts and Ina Garten kind of thing. So what is that about?
Maybe I phrased that not as acutely as I should have. Or rather, our books have to hold their own on bookstore shelves next to the Jamie Olivers and the Nigellas and the Ottolenghis. We have great supportive local bookshops. Or rather, it means that local readers, they have access to so many great books that it's a very wide playing field. So to make sure that we hold our own and we stand out, even though our resources may be different from authors from overseas. We still have to make our mark somehow.
And that's a really good point there, because when you're a local author writing for your audience, you know what they're getting access to in grocery stores and how their ovens work and the climate, which is a really big difference from, say, the British climate and the Singaporean climate. What about that? I mean, when you get books from different countries, is there always a little bit work that needs to happen to get the recipes to actually work in your home kitchens?
Absolutely. And one of these things that always sort of peeved me a little bit about all these, so many sourdough cookbooks have come out over the past 3-4 years, right? And many of them, I find that the authors just assume that their readers have the same room temperature or have the same ambient humidity that they do. And so they don't really address that, which is why, in my book, there's a huge page saying, read this first, and then I list my kitchen conditions. So definitely. And I think these days, if you're going to write a cookbook that you're aiming or you're wishing will be distributed overseas, you have to take into account that many of your readers may not be from where you are. So you have to cater to that somehow, which is why I'm very upfront about my kitchen is 30 Celsius at night and maybe gets sort of 33, 34 in the daytime, may be very different from where you are in Sweden or wherever. And so, your mileage may vary. But it's something that I absolutely have to bear in mind. Also because a lot of my books center on Singaporean heritage food or traditional foodways. And a lot of my readers buy them for visiting friends or tourist friends or to send overseas. So I need to bear that in mind. That not everyone may have the same conditions or have access to the same ingredients that I do.
Authors are typically not that sensitive or caring. I mean, books that are, written overseas, when they come to the United States, they typically go through a process called Americanization. There is an editor who goes through and changes terms, for different instruction methods and also the measurement styles and stuff if you're going from metric to imperial. But the writing itself, it's like you have like 1 or 2 pages, right, on like the temperature in Singapore. And I have been to Singapore and it is damn hot and humid.
And getting worse.
And getting hotter.
Yeah.
So you're writing mostly for the Singaporean audience, but also for an international audience. What fraction of that? Do you break it down for who you're writing for?
Not really. I mean, I don't have like a set proportion in my head that I think about. I just assume that the majority of my readers are Singaporean, but I know I have a sizable enough fraction of readers who are not from here, but are avid enthusiasts about Asian food and Singaporean food. So they would probably already have some baseline knowledge of what I'm, ingredients and stuff that I'm talking about. So I just make sure I'm as clear as possible. I chat with my editors and make sure that they help me catch things that may not be hugely clear. But it's also just because I've written a lot of cookbooks and a lot of it has become sort of reflexive. I don't have to spend so much time agonizing about who's going to read this. And so far, not that many complaints. The biggest complaint I had from my book, The Way of Kueh, which came out in 2019, was that I used sago starch in some of the recipes. And that book was intended primarily for a Singaporean audience or for someone wanting to learn about Singaporean food. So I wasn't as worried about ingredient availability for that one. But I had a lot of readers in Australia and the States DMing me and saying, I can't get sago starch. What can I use instead of sago starch? And I didn't know it wasn't that common. I just assumed you could get it on Amazon like most things. So in my latest book, Nerd Baker 2, the cover photo is of a recipe that was in The Way of Kueh reworked to use only supermarket ingredients, just as a gift to those people who couldn't get sago starch.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your arc. So you've done cookbooks, but you've also had this sort of trilogy of baking books. You had Nerd Baker 1, or you didn't call it Nerd Baker 1, it was just Nerd Baker. And that came out in 2015. Then you had the Way of Kueh that came out in 2019. And now you have Nerd Baker 2, Tales from the East Indies. Did you think of this as a trilogy? Baking books, I feel there's another level of detail and recipe instruction that is required. And one thing that Andrea and I both really love about Nerd Baker 2 is just the level of detail that you have. You talk about ambient room temperature and how that can be very different. What was it about baking that you wanted to do multiple baking books?
Yes, so actually The Way of Kueh is not related to the other two. It happened in between them, but thematically it's not directly related to the other two. I started out as a food writer and I worked my way up to food editor at a magazine company. And then I went freelance and I started writing cookbooks and I started teaching. And I've written in total, I think I have something like 6 solo cookbooks and 8 co-authored cookbooks with different people and for different projects. When I wrote the first Nerd Baker, I pitched it to a small publisher that I knew. This was before the Great British Bake Off triggered the whole worldwide baking thing, which sounds crazy to hear myself say it, but it was before, well before the pandemic, well before baking was a phenomenon on a worldwide scale. And I just wanted to do it, when you're pregnant with book and you have something you need to get out of you and onto the page. And it kind of felt like that. And I had been teaching baking classes for several years at that point. And I was like, I have all these things that I want to explore that a typical regular baking class will not let me. So I have to put it down in a book somewhere. And that became Nerd Baker, which is idiosyncratic, I would say. But because of that sort of slightly unusual, it's a memoir come baking book and it has all these unusual recipes. I think a lot of people didn't know what to make of it then. So if it's any kind of a hit, it's been a sleeper hit, if anything, because that did well enough that people knew me as a sort of a baking and sweet book author. After that, The Way of Kueh came about because I was doing a lot of work with our local slow food chapter. Just for the readers who aren't aware, kueh is just a catch-all term for sweet and savory snacks that we have in Singapore, and not just Singapore, but the region. And they come from different cultures and from different cuisines, but they tend to be bite-sized or eaten in small portions, and most of them have very long ancestries. Through my work with slow food and working with kueh makers and just being interested in the ones from my own heritage, I'm Straits Chinese or Peranakan by my own heritage, so I have both Chinese and Indonesian/Malay forebears. So our heritage cuisine combines influences from both of those. But yes, so doing my work with slow food and other things, I realized that a lot of traditional kuehs, you weren't seeing them in shops anymore. And you weren't even seeing them in private kitchens as much. And people were just not making them. And it was a worrying thing. And this was about the same time that things like macarons and bagels and cannelés were starting to sort of burst beyond the borders of France and take over the pastry world, right? So I thought, okay, I have this opportunity to write this book. I feel I should do it before, a generation passes on that could tell me about all these traditions and foodways. And I applied for a Heritage Board grant. We have a National Heritage Board here that gives grants to support projects that celebrate traditional culture. And I got the grant for that. And then I spent the next 4 years working on The Way of Kueh. And I knew that because that was, supported by government funds, I had to be really rigorous with that and present a clear picture and really do justice to our heritage. And so that took a long time, but it made me much more disciplined and organized in the way I think about presenting information in a cookbook and being clear on how to sort of compartmentalize different steps of a recipe and make sure that the flow is good and you can read it through and understand what is happening. And just to be more systematic about how I list ingredient quantities and ways to articulate things. That was a huge job. And when that came out, I was like, yes, I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to travel and refresh and recharge myself. And I went to Penang to launch that book there because I interviewed a lot of traditional kueh makers in Penang. And then I came back from Penang and 2 weeks later, we went into lockdown.
Right.
So my year of recharge literally became a year of staying at home and baking.
I want to take a pause here, Chris, because, you had put together a heritage Chinese cookbook. I remember that one that's on my shelf.
Yeah.
So the Singaporean government provides money for this? Yeah. Anybody out there, who's listening, who may be tied to a government agency, this is amazing that there is public funds to preserve culinary heritage for like solo operators, that you are not having to be, a nonprofit organization kind of thing. You just apply for it and it's like a grant. That is what you were able to get from the Singaporean government.
I know.
I'm going to just draw the line here, okay, so that listeners can understand that it's pretty friggin' amazing.
It is very cool. I mean, our National Heritage Board, and they look after the museums, they look after how our traditional culture is preserved. Just in general, intangible cultural heritage is a very big thing now around the world, and our Heritage Board has been investing in that. So you can apply for grants, for funds, limited funds, but funds nonetheless, for projects related to cultural heritage. And they have been more open in recent years, which is why I applied for my book. They've been more open about accepting applications for intangible things like cooking, singing, drama, dance. But it's quite a drawn-out process. So you have to submit a long explanation and pitch of what you want the project to be and what you intend for it, who the audience would be, how it would benefit the local heritage community, and how it would explain things to everyone. And then they debate, and you go for interviews, and there's several rounds of vetting. And then because they only have so much, moolah to spread around, right? So I don't know how many people get grants within a given calendar year, but it's not that many. So they have to decide where to disburse their funds.
I mean, that sounds like a book proposal process.
Pretty much. Yeah, so we know the drill.
Right. Yeah, fascinating.
That was just for the Way of Kueh, though. I mean, the Nerd Bakers were not involved with that. But because the Way of Kueh, the topic was of national significance, at least in my mind, I thought I should apply for this.
Yeah. And I feel like Nerd Baker 1 was really your memoir, and Nerd Baker 2 is like this melding of Nerd Baker 1 plus the Way of Kueh.
Thank you. Thank you for spotting that.
Well, I do have a little bit of history with your work, Chris, and with you. So no one thinks of like sourdough and Asian baking, right? Or fermentation and Asian baking. I mean, people think of fermentation and baking. They think of like the bread recipe, like no knead bread or fermentation starters. And everyone was like growing their own starters during the pandemic. But you took it to like this place where you're like, hold on, we got something here too. And I feel like you were making a cultural point about Asian culinary foodways.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of felt like you're saying, hey, you know what? Everyone's into fermentation and sourdough, but hey, we let things sour here too. And we have different kind of yeast balls.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the impetus behind Nerd Baker 2 was that, in Nerd Baker 1, I had a whole chapter about how I've been attempting sourdough for years and just failed. And all my starters died, and everything came out flat and sour, and I just basically gave it up, But during the pandemic, we had time. So I had time to actually nurse something. And it was the baker, Andrew Janjigian. He had this, he wrote this online article about how to maintain a tiny small amount of starter, which is much more feasible in my climate. And I got one going, and it started, and I was so happy. And during that time also, because, we couldn't go out, I was connecting with a lot of bakers via Instagram and just watching everyone swap recipes and swap stories and really dig deep into the whole fermentation culture. I'm not sure if I'd call myself a fermentation expert of any sort. It's just something I enjoy doing. But what I also wanted readers to appreciate was that some of the baking related and fermentation related foodways that we have here in Southeast Asia, some of them date back to the age of exploration, to the Portuguese colonial times and Dutch colonial times and British colonial times. And we have recipes and baked goods that have stretched back to that, but that the rest of the world may not necessarily know about. And if you look at things like South Asian fermented breads like dosa and idli, those are actually technically wild yeast fermented. And they just get ambient yeast from the environment or from fenugreek seeds, and they just ferment overnight. And Andrea, you're right. It's something that we don't explicitly connect in our heads with Western style sourdough, but that's really what they are.
So how did you come up with your recipe list? Were these recipes that you had down that you wanted to have a home for them? One of the things Andrea and I were noticing is just you have these chapter titles with puns. You have this sort of like playfulness with recipes, but also there's a seriousness and there's a depth to the research. So just on your cookbook process, do you write an outline? Do you have the recipe list all intact while you start writing it? Or do you start on certain ideas and see where they take you?
So I always start out with a very clearly defined, or as clearly as I can for myself, a thematic outline for the whole book, and then a sort of skeleton structure with the different chapters. And I try to find some kind of organizational theme for the recipes from the get-go, with the understanding that it might change later on. But I use that as a sort of initial structure to help grow or build the book from that. And I would say with all of my books, I try to have maybe 80% of the recipe ideas on paper, maybe just a title or a 1 or 2 line description. I try to have that from the beginning, and then I expect a good fraction of that to change and develop as the book happens. Quite often when I'm well into a cookbook and nearing the end of the timeline, I will think of something and I was like, oh no, that has to be in there, or I will see something that I've been sort of trying to nurture all along, and I was like, nah, that really doesn't fit. So I do chop and change as I go on, or as the book, every book has its own voice, and as the voice starts to come together and crystallize, I realize that some things I need to put in and some things I need to take out. So I would say with this latest book, Nerd Baker, the final recipe selection, I think maybe 60% of that, no, maybe not even that high, maybe 55% of the recipes were with me from the book's conception, and the rest of them came in later on.
What about the photography? It's an entire book on fermentation, and there is a lot of step-by-step photography.
Yeah.
In the book. So how do you fit that in while you're testing recipes? There's like an A to Z grid of images.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's a lot of work. And the lighting is very consistent. And they're your hands.
Yeah. Okay, you're going to laugh. The area where I photograph all the stuff in my books is literally, it's like a 1.5 meter square patch next to a window in my kitchen. And I literally just have a table and a window, and that's it. So I photograph everything in natural light. I believe if you want the food colors to come out natural, you got to go with that. And also, not being a techie person, I don't really have the time or the budget to fiddle around with multiple kinds of flashes. And I generally just have reflectors and a window, and that's it. But that also gives me a very particular time window during the day that I know I can have good enough lighting for photographs. So that's a good restriction as such. It helps me be more organized. Like, I have to get this done within this time, which also makes it difficult if you have something yeasted, because yeast has its own schedule. So I had to abort or postpone a lot of shoots just because the weather wasn't good that day, or it would start to storm just as something came out of the oven, or because the yeast wasn't cooperating. So that's why this book took a lot longer to shoot than my other books. But for the step-by-step photos, so the main photos, I just have a DSLR. Then for the step-by-steps, I actually use my phone, and I have like a gooseneck tripod that clamps to my table, and I position my phone appropriately. And then I have a camera shutter, which I trigger with my foot. Which is why both my hands can be in shot. So, it took a while to sort of sort this out and get the right kit and everything. But, it helps a lot.
Yeah. The shots are very easy to understand, the motions. So book design wise, how did that figure in? Like, did you already know the trim size of the book, how, the design, like how big the book was? And then you're like, oh, I can fit 26 little, thumbnails in here. And look, that's from A to Z, because there are 26 letters in the alphabet.
Right. It's also just like the number of images, the files you'll have to organize too. So if you have 20 images on one page, how does that all flow? So I'm so curious about this.
I remember one of your other podcast guests said cookbook writing is mostly about file management, and I was punching the air. I was like, yes, someone gets it. It is true. I knew the book's footprint would be the same as Nerd Baker 1, so I had a rough idea of what the page format would be. But I have a very good cookbook designer, my designer Priscilla. I just left it to her basically to decide. I would roughly tell her, I said, I know this one will have about 12 steps and this one will have about 20 steps. But I said, whether in terms of are they square or are they rectangular crops, I'll just leave that to you to decide, because I'm not a trained graphic designer by any means. I try to frame things with a bit more room so that she can crop as she needs to. But it worked out well. I probably gave her several headaches along the way, but she did a fantastic job. Clarity is very important to me. You can see how many pictures that I did choose for the steps in some of the recipes. Videos are one thing, but videos, you have to use one hand to stop and pause and come back and replay stuff, whereas books, you can just prop them open and leave them there. So it's very important to have a very clear flow through all the step-by-step pictures in a book.
It's like a flip book.
Yeah, right, like a flip book.
Yeah.
What you did too is that you incorporated the photos into the way you wrote the recipes, which I think sometimes is hard for authors to do, because if you're writing a recipe but the photo shoot happens, say 6 months later, you're not necessarily, maybe you don't have the manuscript in front of you to be able to tweak. But since you were taking the photos while you were working on these recipes, I mean, one example for our listeners, for your French loaf recipe, you have a line that says, The dough will strengthen enough to form a window pane which rips with ragged-edged round holes. And you have a photo of what this window pane should look like. And I remember, I think the first baking books I ever read, they always talked about window pane. And for listeners who don't know that term, it's, you hold up the dough and you can either see through it or not. Or I was always so confused by this term because I always thought your dough wasn't right unless you had this beautiful window pane. And you go into depth on what the window pane actually is. And then you have this example of like, it should look like this. It should look torn. It shouldn't be this complete sort of sheer piece of dough.
I had the same reaction when I saw that picture, Kate, because I was like, oh, so I'm not a loser.
Right, 100%.
Thank you for appreciating that. I'm very big about signposts. I think signposts are really important when you're writing a recipe. And this is also from when I was writing The Way of Kueh, I was delving into very old recipe books, some going back literally 100 years, right? And a lot of them in that very typically terse way that old cookbooks do. They will go steam until done, bake until done, which if you've never made the recipe before is absolutely no help at all. So when I write a recipe, I'm always thinking, how do I tell the reader when you need to stop mixing or when this stage is over and you need to progress to the next stage? And it's very important for me to give some sort of indication, whether it's visual or I think one of the recipes I mentioned, the dough will make a whiffling noise as it moves around the bowl. And that's an audible indicator. So it's very important to put these things in for people who may not have encountered the recipe before. I have to pinch myself and make sure that I am doing all these things.
Well, Chris, one of the things that you've always done so well, you have like these beautiful verbs that you use and adjectives in your writing that I don't encounter in a lot of cookbooks. And honestly, sometimes I steal from you.
Okay, everybody heard it here. Now we know where Andrea gets these great verbs.
I go to another Southeast Asian country, my friends.
Oh, I wanted to say just about the steps. The main good thing about doing my own photography is that I save my publisher money, I save myself money, and I have a lot more input into the visual aesthetic of the whole book. But a good thing about step-by-steps in particular is that the writing of the recipe text and the photographing of the steps feed back into each other. So if I write the recipe one way and then I do the shoot of the steps and I realize, oh no, I should break this step here, that makes more sense with the photos, then I do that. So I typically don't finish editing a recipe until after all the steps have been shot. And I realized I can combine these into one step, or I can have to break this up into 3 steps. And that helps a lot.
Do you have bullet points of the steps that you want to shoot before you start shooting it?
Yeah, absolutely. In my head, I have a list of bullet points. But then along the way, as I shoot, if I see something that is particularly noteworthy, I will just take the extra shot anyway and then decide later, Okay, so the coil folding of the sourdough, I ended up with 80 shots of the whole process, and I just had to whittle them down. So that was a bit of a slog, but better more than less, I always say.
Was that one dough, or did you have to do multiple doughs to get all those 80 shots?
I did 3 different sessions for that, and then I picked the best of those 3. So it's all the same dough in that particular sequence, but I had 3 attempts to choose from.
And how do you do that with the climate? I mean, not only were you talking about the light, but also like the climate. Bread books are hard for a reason. You've got a moving target.
One thing also is knowing how to Photoshop things to make them more consistent. What I lack in camera gear and weather, I make up for in Photoshop.
Oh, that's smart.
Hey, it's Andrea Nguyen. Are you enjoying this episode of Everything Cookbooks? I sure hope you are. But to be honest, it takes money to make every single show, and we need your help to keep the lights on. To pitch in, head on over to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you'll see a range of options. If there's an insider event scheduled, sign on up to learn more about the cookbook publishing world. Order books through our affiliate page. We've got merch too, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and writing caps. Or just buy us a round of coffee. You can also leave us a review. Help us out however you can. Molly, Chris, and Kate and I value every single bit of support. Thanks so much for your kindness. Did you have recipe testers in different climates?
No, I didn't. That's one thing that I've never been able to afford is recipe testers. My degree is in psychology, and I was big on the sciences at school, so I know about scientific experiments and how to be rigorous in applying changes in experiment parameters. So I take that approach with my own recipe testing. I do have baker friends, and sometimes I would just say, can you just try this? And very often I will actually pass them the results of my tests and ask for taste feedback. But the kind of schedules that I have for cookbook writing and the kind of budget that I have, I can't really afford recipe testers, which I know is mandatory in the States, right, for most cookbooks?
Theoretically, yes.
Right.
They're supposed to be tested by someone else, every single recipe.
Hmm.
But I don't know how many publishers enforce that. Do you?
I have no idea. There's always a clause in a contract that says your recipes were tested, but whether that's, 10 recipes were tested by your grandmother, or all the recipes have been tested by an outside party, or a combination, it's really hard to say. I don't think there's no fact checker who's going after cookbook writers. But, the ones, the people who have a track record of writing reliable recipes, Andrea has a track record. They'll follow your recipes because they can trust you. If somebody comes out with a book and they don't have a track record and the recipes don't work, it's harder for them to maybe get a second book deal.
Yeah. But Chris, you kind of have this fabulous kind of insurance policy is what I call them, section in the front of the book, the ground rules on ingredients and equipment that I just absolutely love.
Thank you.
Because I've had a lot of questions about Asian flours and starches and the way that they behave, but I never had the opportunity to write them down. So I've had a lot of theories in my head, and you helped really crystallize a lot of those notions. And the section is quite extensive. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you were thinking of when you put those ground rules together?
I think that just stems from me writing a lot of heritage cookbooks and having to explain slightly unusual or slightly rare ingredients. But also understanding that a lot of local cooks here, they will use something like tapioca starch or cornstarch because they know that's the starch to use, but they may not know why that is the best starch to use. And I remember when you were writing Asian dumplings, and we had several conversations about starches and this kind of thing. So you helped me to sort of focus on that as well, and realize that I needed to be especially clear about this. But I think also as the world shrinks and supply chains expand and you can get everything online now, I think I'm very aware that readers have much more access to different ingredients from around the world, and the whole sago starch thing again. But I dislike ambiguity in cookbooks. I like to be clear in my mind, and I like to start cooking with a calm awareness of why I need all these things and what they should be for. In my career as a writer as well, I've had to read and review shoddily edited cookbooks that left out a lot of this information. So it's also from seeing errors or maybe unintentional mistakes that other cookbooks have made and realizing, okay, I had to pick myself up on that one when it comes to my turn. But I cannot assume that the all-purpose flour that you have is the same as the all-purpose flour that I have, which is why I do things like I list the protein contents. And matching the protein contents of flours is the best way to ensure consistency if you have a recipe from somewhere else. So I'm very sort of anal about that. And as upfront as possible about what I'm using. And wheat flour in particular, watching all these online sourdough bakers, and they all use freshly milled flour, and they have these particular brands like Justos that they like to use. And I can't get any of that. I don't have any flour mills near me. So I need to know what can I use instead. And I had to do my own research for that. It's the fruits of this kind of learning that I've tried to put in the book.
I just got some Justos the other day, Chris, at my health food store. I don't want.
Oh, now he's going to be jealous.
Yeah, and he's going to be jealous. And I'm ordering some freshly milled flour in the mail as we speak. But I was very curious about that because with the wheat baking in Asia, Asian flours they're just a different animal.
Yeah.
So I thought that it was rather bold of you to tackle sourdough bread in Asia with a recipe, because I was like, where is he getting his flour and how is it going to be consistent? But Singapore also has access to a lot of different ingredients that other parts of Asia do not.
And honestly, I probably couldn't have written the sourdough chapter 6 to 7 years ago because we didn't have consistently high quality flour of the kind that works best in sourdough. But we have very good Japanese bread flour now. We get all the Bob's Red Mill products. We get a Canadian high protein wheat flour. Even that's relatively easy to obtain now. So that was good. But despite having successfully baked sourdough only since the pandemic, I realized that there must be other bakers out there who have struggled with it as I have, and who struggle with sourdough in an Asian climate like I do. So I wrote the sourdough chapter because I want to hold hands with them. It's not that I'm sitting on a mountaintop like a guru saying, this is how you make sourdough in Asia. but I'm an acolyte just like them, and I'm trying to progress along the path. And this is what I learned, and I'm sharing that with you, and hopefully that will help you in some way. Because sourdough is an ever-evolving ball game.
So how do you research and develop a recipe for like the smiling bao, the char siu bao, the Cantonese one? Because that for me is amongst the holy grails of leavened yeast products.
Yeah.
Forget sourdough, to tell you the truth.
Yes.
I was like dialed into the bao.
Yeah.
And for those of you who've like gone to eat dim sum or walked into a Chinese bakery and you see those white puffy Wonder Bread like buns, they cost nothing. Well, they take so much effort and knowledge to make. And Chris has a lovely recipe in his book that I just am chomping at the bit. I'm trying to gather all my ingredients. Okay. And so we used to get Hong Kong flour here pretty easily, but now we don't. So yeah. But I think I found something that's worthy of your recipe. So how did that come along?
So I've been attempting or trying out steam bun recipes for 25 years now. And I remember, again, when you were writing Asian Dumplings, that we had so many conversations about this. But that very particular dim sum restaurant style of char siu bao with that bursts open at the top, that eluded me for many, many years. And I just kept buying book after book and looking for old Hong Kong cookbooks on like eBay and whatever, looking at all these old recipes. And you know, traditionally, and I do mention this in the book, a lot of dim sum are made with a sourdough culture that is maintained by dim sum restaurants, but it's a very specific Chinese style of sourdough. If you want to watch a good video about it, there's a YouTube channel called Chinese Cooking Demystified. They did a whole video several months ago about Chinese sourdough, lao mian, old dough.
Lao mian.
Right. What really cracked open the recipe for me was that I realized that most of the rise in that style of char siu bao is from the chemical leavening, not from the natural leavening. And the yeast is there, the sourdough is there to make the dough acidic, so then you can load it with alkaline ingredients, and then their intense reaction during the high heat steaming is what busts the bao open, you know. And this was like a slow dawning realization. I was reading all the old recipes about it, and I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Once I realized that was the thing, it then just became a matter of finding the right baking powder, balancing the acid and the alkali so you don't end up with too alkaline bao that are brown or too acidic bao that just taste horrible, and then finding that equilibrium. But I realized that quite often when you have a restaurant char siu bao, you have it hot and you can mainly taste the char siu and the sauce, and you feel the texture of the fluffy bao, and that's great. But when you let it cool down and then you taste it, it actually doesn't taste very nice. Quite often the dough just tastes really weird, and I think it's because they use such highly bleached flour. One thing that we're lucky here in Singapore, I can get unbleached bao flour, which is very low protein. So I have all the flavor of wheat, but none of that weird chemical bleached aftertaste.
Yeah. No, thank you. I've had the same kind of epiphanies, but that was a 20-year journey.
Yeah.
Even more, since we were kids, probably, when we've wondered about that. And that's among the mysteries of Asian yeast doughs.
And a lot of the old cookbooks, they just won't tell you about it, or they won't go into the science behind it. I have this otherwise very interesting book about the history of dim sum in Hong Kong, which is bilingual in Mandarin and English, you know, except that all the recipes make like 200. And the only bit that is not translated into English is the glossary, in which they talk about the old dough sourdough. So it's like, you know, I had angels flying around my head on the day that I made my first successful busted open bao.
One of the things, too, is that in your recipes, they're streamlined. You know, obviously, these recipes take a lot of care to write and to develop. But then when you're reading them, as a reader, they're easy to understand. And one of the things I was thinking of is, like we were talking about, that hardworking section, like read this first, this, you know, the kind of rules of the road. And what you did was really clever because you put some specific techniques in there. And then in the recipe, it just says, you know, page 16. So you don't have to over-explain everything. I mean, I think, and I've written baking recipes, it's always like you just repeat the same steps and it takes up so many words. But here you can have more room for the photos, which might help more people figure out those specific movements.
But Kate, isn't that an American thing? Like, you know, our editors say, people don't want to turn the page, so you better repeat the same damn set of instructions a gazillion times.
And then the recipe ends up to be 2,000 words long, right?
Exactly. No, I mean, Asian dumplings, the same instructions repeated over and over because there's this fear of people not wanting to turn the page. And then also there's this fear of when, let's say media picks a recipe up.
Right.
You send that recipe off and it's like going to be missing something. I mean, there's just like all of this stuff so that all of a sudden, what could be a 500 word or 300 word recipe now is like 800 words.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Chris, tell me about what it's like in Singapore with your books. You've never gotten pushback about that.
Most of my books have been written with small publishers. And in this case, what you're talking about with the essential techniques bundled together at the beginning of the book, that was primarily for space saving because I knew I had a page count to stick to. And my editors know that I tend to overwrite and then have to cut. So I thought from the word go, I know I'm going to be repeating certain sequences of instructions for particular doors that apply in multiple instances. So I'm just going to have to extract that and put it at the front. So the major impetus for that was exactly space saving. Also, a lot of these things, bakers are very good at having the rubrics locked away in their heads. They know that if the dough is of this texture, then I'm going to have to do this and this and this. It's kind of it reflects my internal filing as well, if you will.
Right. And that is true. That's different with baking. I think with when you're doing baking with certain types of doughs that are similar, there are a lot of similar steps. So if someone's baking through a chapter, they're going to anticipate what you mean. If you just say the phrase, and then they'll say, this is the time where I get the flour, I weigh it out, I pour the hot water on, I stir it, I let it sit for 8 hours or so. You can kind of memorize those steps. And also I think baking books, they're almost like more hardworking craft books where you kind of feel like you're going to a school, like you're going to class and you're learning through each chapter in a way. But you teach classes. I mean, did that also impact the way you write recipes?
No, absolutely. And when you teach cooking classes, you never know the baseline level of knowledge that your students are going to bring to a class. So you better spell out everything for them. So I would say that my recipes for classes are definitely more lengthy than my book recipes. And I will have, sometimes half a page of notes after each recipe just to unpick certain things. But it's from teaching for so long that has sharpened my sense of what I do need to put in and what I do need to spell out. And sometimes I will do a class in which I teach one basic bread dough and then variations on that. So that will then be more like the book in which I have this one foundation recipe. And then the other recipes will just say one recipe of that dough, please refer back to the dough recipe. And then on the page for the other recipes, you will just have a filling or some other components, but I won't repeat the basic dough recipe again.
Sure. You mentioned that you work with a lot of small publishers. How does cookbook publishing work in Singapore?
Not that many publishers really do a lot of cookbooks here, because of the expense and the labor to physically produce a nice big cookbook. So there are only a few that really have committed themselves to it. There seems to have been a lot more interest in fiction in recent years in terms of the way the arts are celebrated or promoted here. There's been a lot more interest in fiction and poetry in the last several years, and not so much in nonfiction as its own discipline. But it's a pretty small scene. There are not that many cookbook authors. We all tend to know each other. We all tend to see each other at the writers' festivals. It's kind of nice, and if I see my friends' cookbooks next to mine on the bookstore shelf, I will sometimes just take a photo and post it on Instagram and say, hey, we're in good company today. So that's kind of nice. If it's a small pool and you're a small fish, then it all seems big to you.
And what about if people want to buy your book that don't live in Singapore? How do we find it?
Yeah, that's the challenging thing. Small publishers sometimes have a difficult time finding overseas distributors, also because there are laws and limits on how many books you can export or import or pay tariffs on. I'm very blessed in that my books in the US are stocked at Kitchen Arts and Letters in New York. Thanks to you, Andrea. Thank you for recommending me for that. And then also by a bookshop called Elmendorf Baking in Boston.
Oh, they're great. Yeah.
Which found my book quite independently. I only found out about it afterwards.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. What about Kinokuniya?
Kinokuniya in Singapore has been a huge supporter. I worked with them for launches of some of my books over the years, and they are really good at displaying local authors' books prominently and making sure that they occupy good shelf space for everyone to see. And in fact, Nerd Baker 2, I just launched at Kinokuniya a month and a half ago. Good time. I don't know whether the different Kinokuniyas around the world can sort of do internal orders. It seems like that's difficult.
Yeah. The Kinokuniyas here in the United States, and that's a Japanese bookstore, stationery store that is oftentimes attached to Mitsuwa supermarkets in the United States.
Oh.
They carry Japanese cookbooks. but they
Right.
don't carry cookbooks that are going to be published elsewhere. And then they'll carry books that are published in the United States, that a small selection of Asian themed books. But I wondered about that too. They're so influential in Asia, as they're like the sole cross-border international Asian bookshop.
Absolutely.
I was like, so why don't they carry your books here? But it may just be a cost thing, Chris, because they don't have that many copies of cookbooks in each shop.
Yeah. I mean, the main Kinokuniya branch in Singapore is definitely the biggest cookbook selection.
And outside of Singapore, where is your biggest market?
I don't know. I seem to connect with a lot of readers in the States via Instagram. So I know I have a lot of readers there. And I know a lot of displaced Singaporeans, when they come back to Singapore, they will buy a copy of my books and bring it back to wherever they're living, whether it's Europe or America. So I kind of want to say the US, but potentially Australia as well, even though I don't think a lot of my books have Australian distributors. And that's something that my publisher looks after. But I need to be a little bit more proactive on my own to sort of contact scrappy independent bookshop and say, hey, would you like to stock my books? But I don't know. I don't really know where my prime readership is outside of Singapore.
That's really fascinating. And I think this will also just help a lot of readers who are publishing in a different country and are trying to figure out how to get their books into people's hands. I mean, having these relationships with, say, a bookstore like Kitchen Arts and Letters, I mean, that's all through, say, you meeting people, interacting on social media, making connections, meeting people in sort of the world of cooking and baking. And I think all of us can do a better job of that no matter what country we live in. Just sometimes a reason a bookstore is going to stock your book is they have some sort of link to you. Yeah. So I think that's actually really just smart.
And just as readers and authors as well, we should all be supporting our local bookshops that are really passionate about getting books out to people. I feel those numbers are dwindling every day around the world. What with online bookstores being more prominent. I've met such lovely people in the book trade who are really gung-ho about helping books to find owners.
Absolutely.
But Chris, you mentioned Instagram a few times in your comments here, and you're rather disciplined in terms of your approach with Instagram. And I noticed that during the pandemic. I know you said you had a lot of time, but you started having things like Moldy Mondays, and it's not just about mold and ferment. I didn't even know you're going to write a book about fermentation. But tell us a little bit about your approach to social media on Instagram.
Andrea, it was when you were in Singapore last and you were telling me that I have to have a bigger presence on social media and I really needed to invest the time. So it's thanks to you that I'm on Instagram at all. But when the pandemic started, I had only been on Instagram for a few months and I wasn't used to it yet. During the pandemic, everyone was using that as a good platform to connect with each other. So my knowledge of how to use it and how to connect with people over it grew by leaps and bounds just during that time. And this whole thing about hashtags, it took me months to even realize what a hashtag was and how you could use it. That kind of just grew organically, that I noticed some of my posts were getting more attention than others. And I was like, oh, it's because of that. So the whole Moldy Monday things, and that started out being about kueh molds, so actually physical molds as opposed to fermentation molds, right? And that's how that began. And I was like, oh, this is fun. Let's just do this as much for myself so I could keep track of the things that I was posting, and then just to let other people easily find these posts of mine that come attached with particular information about heritage or all that. But I'm not sure if you can say that I'm disciplined about it. I'm still a little bit ad hoc when it comes to do I post this or not. But I will say that Instagram has been a tremendous place for me to connect with other bakers and even food heroes of mine, like Darryl Goldstein, who's been on your podcast, people whose cookbooks I've owned for ages, but never had any contact with. And then, during the past couple of years, I've reached out or I've liked their posts and we've had conversations, and it's been fantastic, I have to say. So I'm very thankful for Instagram for that.
Before we wrap up our conversation, having this long-term success as a food writer who's written a lot of books, who's written a lot of articles, who's written internationally and for your local audience, what sort of words of advice do you have for somebody who's looking for ways to keep going, keep pushing the envelope?
Read a lot. Like they say, garbage in, garbage out, right? So feed yourself with good books and good sources of information. And in terms of cookbook scope, I would say as the world shrinks through communication networks, for the last few years and certainly going forward, I assume that my book will find something of a global audience. How big, I don't know, but I assume that I am writing for people outside my immediate community, and I will gear my writing towards that. In terms of the actual writing and recipe writing, I guess what I would say is just remember why you fell in love with the whole pursuit in the first place. Go back to those writers that you loved when you were young or when you were starting out. If it's someone that you haven't read in a while, and then you go back to it and you find that as you've matured as a writer and as a cook, you actually approach it with a different mindset and you receive things differently. Return to your first love and let that continue to feed you, and just cook a lot. One of my soapboxes is to encourage everyone to cook at home more, because I think that it's a dying out. And in Singapore, we have a very, very ramified and diverse eating out culture, to the extent that I worry that people aren't cooking at home enough. And if you think about it, when you talk about a country's national cuisine, it is born in home kitchens. So I always tell people, my students, and when I give talks, I was like, if our national cuisine is what is brewing in your kitchen, what will your grandchildren and great-grandchildren think of as national cuisine 30, 40, 50 years down the road? Will it be pasta? Will it be a rice dish? Yeah, cook a lot, cook at home.
It's been a joy having you here today, Chris.
Oh, me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is also available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.